You can tell everything about a man by how he treats those who can do nothing for him. In the parish of Thornwick, in the high moorland riding of Yorkshire, that saying was attributed to the old Duke of Ashbourne, who had repeated it at every christening, every harvest supper, and every magistrate's sitting for 30 years before the November morning he rode out into a storm and did not come back. His horse returned without him. His body was never found. The county held its inquests and its whispers, and finally declared him dead. His son, who had been 19 years old and unacquainted with grief in any of its forms, became the 20th Duke of Ashbourne without ceremony, and put the saying away as a thing that belonged to a man who was gone. That was 11 years ago. The saying had belonged too to a woman named Clara Voss, who had been the estate's head seamstress and the late Duke's most trusted domestic voice for the better part of 2 decades. She had embroidered it on a sampler that hung in the servants' corridor, stitching each letter with the care she brought to everything, because care was the one luxury available to people of her station in unlimited supply. She was 43 now, and the sampler had been taken down when the new Duke arrived and ordered the corridor repainted in a fashion more suitable to modern taste. She had kept the sampler folded in her trunk, and she thought of it each time she stood at the window of the West Gatehouse, watching the road that came up from the valley and turned between the lime trees and arrived, eventually, at the main gate that was her charge. Clara had not been given the gatehouse as a courtesy. She had been moved into it in the manner of an object being set aside, a thing of possible future utility placed on a shelf where it would not disturb the new arrangement of the room. The new Duke, Edmund Ashbourne, had arrived from London in March with a steward of his own choosing, a man named Graves, who wore boots of unnecessary expense, and spoke to the domestic staff with the particular register of a man who has recently acquired authority and is not yet comfortable enough in it to be generous. Within a fortnight, Graves had reorganised the household according to principles that appeared to be primarily aesthetic, replacing the competent with the deferential and the experienced with the malleable. The cook, who had served 30 years, was pensioned with thanks, but without regret. The head gardener, who had known every soil condition of every bed from the kitchen garden to the south, was reduced to the supervision of a boy and a wheelbarrow. Clara, who had managed the linen room, the sewing girls, the mending ledgers, and the quiet 1,000 decisions that kept a house of 40 servants running without audible friction, found herself reassigned to the gatehouse with the title of Gate Warden, a position that had not previously existed at Ashbourne Hall, and that Graves had apparently invented for the purpose of making her departure from. The main house feel official rather than punitive. She was to log deliveries, verify credentials of callers, manage the tradespeople, and ensure no undesirables came up the drive without prior approval from the house. There was a small office in the gatehouse arch, 2 rooms above it, a cast iron stove of uncertain temperament, and a view of the drive that was, she admitted privately, rather fine in the early morning when the mist was still on the lime trees and the rooks were setting up their morning arrangements in the elms beyond the wall. She did not complain. She had nowhere else to go, which was a condition she observed without self-pity, as one observes the weather. Her parents had been long dead, her one sister married to a factor in Aberdeen, and she had given the productive decades of her life to Ashbourne Hall, and could not now imagine beginning elsewhere. She moved her trunk, her writing desk, the 3 novels she had been carrying since her last trip to Edinburgh, the sampler, and the grey cat she had taken in the previous spring when he fell from a gatepost during a hard rain, and appeared not to notice the fall in any way that indicated it had taught him anything, and she settled herself into the 2 rooms above the arch as though she had chosen them deliberately. The cat she called Newton, because he had arrived in her life by falling, and because he regarded gravity with what appeared to be personal affront. Edmund Ashbourne, the 20th Duke, was not a cruel man. Clara had arrived at this conclusion through the method she applied to all conclusions, which was sustained observation without the interference of preference. He was, however, a sealed man, as some houses are sealed, the shutters drawn against weather so long ago that no one can remember whether there was weather to begin with, or whether the house was simply built with the shutters closed and has never been otherwise. He had been sent to school at 7, placed in his uncle's household at 12, when the old Duke found the daily management of a child inconvenient and his own grief for a dead wife more absorbing, packed off to the army at 17, and returned to Thornwick only when the inheritance demanded his return and there was no longer any avoiding it. He did not know the estate. He did not know the land or the people on it. He did not, Clara suspected, know himself particularly well, and he wore this uncertainty as arrogance, the way frightened horses pin their ears and widen their eyes to look larger than they are. He rode out every morning before the household was properly awake, alone on a large dark horse named Cossack that no one else was permitted to handle, and returned with mud on his boots and a jaw set in a manner that discouraged conversation of all but the most pressing variety. He spent his evenings in his study with the estate accounts and a glass of port, and whatever he found in the accounts apparently did not please him, because the glass was rarely empty and the door was usually closed. When he passed Clara at the gatehouse he nodded, once, with the precision of a man who has been trained in courtesy but has not yet learned that courtesy and warmth are different undertakings. She returned the nod and logged the time of his departure in her ledger, which Graves had instructed her to maintain, and watched him go down the drive and through the lime trees and out onto the moor road with a particular quality of attention she gave to things she was still trying to understand. Newton watched him too, from the top of the gatepost, with his tail wrapped around his feet and his amber eyes tracking the horse and rider until they were gone. Newton had not yet made up his mind about the Duke, which was unusual for a cat of his decisiveness, and Clara thought it meant something without knowing quite what. It was October when the stranger came. The rains had begun early that year, coming down from the high moor in long grey curtains that stripped the last leaves from the elms and turned the gravel drive to a sludge that gripped at wheels and made the smaller bridges over the beck uncertain. Clara had spent the morning logging 2 deliveries of coal, one of salt fish and one inexplicable crate of Italian glassware addressed to a Mrs. Hargrove, who did not appear to exist at Ashbourne Hall and who Graves eventually determined, was expected at a house of similar name in Derbyshire. She had sent Newton inside because the wet made his ears press flat and his temper short, and she was relighting the stove, which had gone out in the damp, when she heard the sound at the outer gate. It was not the sound of a visitor arriving with intent. It was the sound of hands finding iron bars by feel rather than by sight, the careful exploratory sound of someone who had been walking in rain long enough that looking and touching had become nearly the same act, and vision was something to confirm rather than to lead with. She went to the door and looked through the bars at the man on the other side. He was old, or he appeared old, which is not the same thing. The brim of his hat had been beaten flat and shapeless by the rain, and the water ran off it in a steady stream, as from a roof gutter. His coat had been good once, the quality still visible in the cut and the drape of the wool despite everything the weather had done to it. But the wool was saturated, and the elbows had been mended with material of a different weight, and then mended again with material that matched neither original nor repair. The lapels were held together by a pin fashioned from a nail bent into a hook. His boots, which had also been good once, were bound at the toes with strips of rag tied in string, and on his feet the string had darkened near black with wet. He was very still. This was the detail that alarmed her. People who arrived at gates after long walks in cold rain arrived with agitation in them, shivering, shifting their weight, reaching for the nearest solid upright. This man was still as something that has used all its available motion and has come to rest not from comfort but from depletion, the way a fire is still when it is out. Clara opened the gate. She did not ask his business. She did not ask his name, or where he was going, or what he wanted. She asked if he would like to come in out of the rain. He looked at her from under the ruined brim. His eyes were grey and clear and quite calm, arranged in a face of such complete weathering that she could not have said his age within 2 decades in either direction. The weathering was thorough enough to be interesting, which was her first detailed observation, followed immediately by the second, which was that the calmness in the eyes was not the calmness of a man at ease, but the calmness of a man who has been through enough weather, internal and external, that more of it no longer disturbs the surface. He said he would not wish to trouble her. She said he was no trouble, and held the gate wider, and after a moment he came in. She sat him near the stove, which was now producing heat of a cautious and experimental nature, and gave him the mug of tea she had been keeping warm for herself, and the heel of bread she had set aside for Newton's afternoon. The man ate the bread with a deliberateness she recognised from long acquaintance with genuine hunger, not the particular hunger of a missed meal, but the deeper hunger of a man who has been rationing for long enough that the body has adjusted its expectations downward. He broke the bread into pieces smaller than necessary and ate each piece with full attention. The way one rations not the food itself, but the experience of eating, drawing out the sensation because the next meal has no certain time. When the stove had done its work and some of the wet had steamed from his coat, he told her his name was Thomas. He offered no surname easily, without apparent awkwardness, as though surnames were simply a form he had stopped carrying. He said he had been walking from Scarborough, which was 30 miles to the east along the coast road and then inland, and that he was looking for work of any kind, stable work or ditch work or wood splitting. He was not particular. He said the word particular with a faint emphasis that suggested he had once been very particular and had learned, through whatever method teaches such things, not to be. His voice was educated. This was not the voice of the coat or the rags, and it was not the voice of a man who had always been poor. It was the voice of a man who had been formed by one life and was living another, and there was between the two lives a gap that could be heard in the precise way he constructed a sentence even when he was choosing plain words. Clara noted this as she noted everything, without drawing attention to what she had noticed, filing it alongside the hands, which were strong and roughened from outdoor work, but which carried in the joints, and the way they held the mug the memory of a life that had been otherwise. She told him honestly that there was no work at the hall just now, that Graves had taken on no new outdoor staff since spring, and showed no intention of doing so before spring came again. She told him this with precision and without apology, because the facts were the facts, and he deserved accurate ones. Then she told him he could sit until the rain eased, because a man who had walked 30 miles from Scarborough in an October rain on a heel of bread was not being sent back into it on the grounds of a staffing policy. Thomas thanked her with a gravity that was more than the occasion seemed to warrant, a fullness to the thanks that suggested the occasion was not quite what it appeared to be on its surface. She filed this too. He stayed 3 hours. During that time Clara worked at her mending, because she kept the household linens in good repair as a matter of settled habit, regardless of whether the habit was still her formal duty. Graves had removed it from her official responsibilities along with everything else, but the linens still appeared outside her door twice a week in a covered basket, sent, she was fairly certain, by the housekeeper's girl who had worked under her for 6 years and had not forgotten whose eye was reliable. She mended, and they spoke in the rhythm of people who have discovered, without having to test it, a shared relationship with comfortable silence. He asked about the estate in the way of someone who wants to know how a place is doing, rather than what it is worth. She answered in the way of someone who knows the difference between those two questions, and is glad to be asked the right one. He asked how long the lime trees had been planted along the drive. She said they had been planted by the late Duke's father, more than 50 years ago, and that they were in better condition now than they had been in the dry summer 5 years back, when the top thirds of them had gone the colour of old straw and everyone had thought they might not recover. He asked what had been done for them. She said nothing had been done for them, that they had decided to recover on their own when the rains came back in autumn, and that in her experience most things did, given sufficient time and the right weather. Newton arrived eventually from behind the trunk and performed his assessment. He approached the unfamiliar boots with careful scientific method, investigating them first at a distance, then at intermediate range with one extended paw, then by direct contact of nose. Having completed his analysis, he settled himself on top of the boots with the air of a creature who has reached a satisfactory conclusion and sees no need to revisit it. Clara watched this with private satisfaction and said nothing about it. When the rain had reduced from curtain to suggestion, Thomas stood and took his ruined hat from the hook and put it back on his head. He picked up his branch. At the door he stopped, and his grey eyes went to the sampler that was leaning against the wall beside the trunk, not yet hung, because she had not decided whether hanging it here was a claim she wanted to make about where she was and how permanently she intended to be there. He said the stitching was very fine. She said it had been a long time since anyone had remarked on it. She said she had made it 30 years ago, her first winter at the Hall, when she had been young enough to stitch small and her eyes had been equal to it. Thomas looked at the sampler and then at Clara and said it was a good saying. He said he had heard it somewhere, long ago, and had thought so even then. He said it with the manner of a man touching something he has not thought about in years and finding it still warm. Then he put his hand briefly on the doorframe, steadying himself, and went out into the rain and walked away down the drive between the stripped lime trees. Clara stood in the doorway long after he was gone. Newton came and pressed against her ankle. She was aware, with the precision of a woman who does not often allow herself imprecision, that she was more disturbed by his leaving than she could reasonably account for. Edmund returned that afternoon from his morning ride later than usual, which meant something had kept him on the moor, and he found her still in the doorway with her arms folded and her face arranged in the expression of a woman doing quiet and complex arithmetic. He pulled Cossack up and looked at her with the expression he wore when something had broken his usual assumption that no one near the gatehouse would merit particular attention. He asked if something was wrong. Clara gave him a complete account of the afternoon. Name Thomas, no surname offered. Walking from Scarborough, looking for work of any kind, no position currently available. Sitting out the rain for 3 hours in the gatehouse. She described the voice, the quality of the hands, the condition of the coat. She mentioned, because it was a relevant data point and she believed in relevant data points, that Newton had assessed him favourably. Edmund looked at Newton, who had appeared in the doorway behind Clara at some point, and was watching Edmund with the particular amber attention he reserved for matters not yet decided. Edmund asked what Newton was. Clara said he was her cat. A pause. Edmund looked at the cat with the expression of a man who cannot determine whether he is being made sport of and does not want to ask in case the answer is yes. Newton looked back at him with perfect equanimity. Edmund said he was sure the cat was a fine judge of character. Clara said he was the finest she knew. The silence had a different quality than their usual silences, which were brief and transactional. This one lasted several seconds, and neither of them moved to fill it. Edmund, who was not practised at unbroken silence in the presence of staff, looked away first, turning Cossack toward the house. He rode up the drive without looking back. Clara watched the set of his shoulders as he went, which was slightly less set than when he had arrived, and thought about this in the way she thought about most things, carefully and without rushing to a conclusion. The stranger came again 4 days later, on a morning of clear cold with frost on the grass and the moor showing white along the high ridge. Edmund was at the gate himself, returned from his ride early, waiting because the pedestrian door had swollen with the recent rain and stuck on its frame at a precise angle that required a particular combination of upward pressure and outward pull that Clara had discovered and no one else had yet learned. He stood with Cossack's reins in his hand, looking out at the moor road with the expression he wore when he was not looking at anything in particular, which was the expression he wore most of the time. Thomas came across the frost-silvered grass from the direction of the village moving with the measured care of a man who has learned to manage his pace over long distances. He stopped when he saw Edmund standing at the gate, and Edmund turned from the moor when he registered the movement. And there was between them a stillness that was not the comfortable stillness of strangers, with nothing to say but the stillness of recognition that cannot find its object, a resonance looking for its source. Edmund asked the man his name. Thomas gave it. Edmund asked where he was going. Thomas said he had come back to see whether any position had opened at the Hall, as he had heard the estate sometimes took on outdoor men through the autumn. His voice made no claim on sentiment, and no appeal to previous hospitality. It was the voice of a man asking a practical question and prepared for a practical answer. Edmund studied him with the diagnostic frown he had been applying to the estate ledgers for 8 months, looking for the seam where the surface explanation stopped and the actual explanation began. He told Thomas to wait. He handed Cossack's reins to the gate boy, who materialised at his elbow with the useful timing of a good hall servant, and walked up to the house. He was gone 20 minutes. Clara watched from the gatehouse window. When Edmund returned, he told Thomas there was a position in the stable yard, not a horseman's position, yardman's work only. Sweeping and water carrying and evening tack cleaning. 2 shillings a week and board in the outer stable loft. He said these terms once, without elaboration or apology, and waited. Thomas accepted with a single nod, making no negotiation and expressing no gratitude beyond a plain thank you that was none the less substantial in its delivery. He accepted as a man accepts something he came looking for, while genuinely unsure he would find it, with a gravity that was neither relief nor resignation, but something that partook of both. Edmund came back through the gate. He remounted Cossack. As he rode past the gatehouse, he glanced sideways at Clara, with the expression of a man who expects assessment and is genuinely uncertain of the verdict. Clara said, "Newton was right." Edmund did not answer, but the something adjacent to a smile moved across his face again, quick and unguarded, and he rode on up the lime tree drive, and Clara stood in the gatehouse arch and watched him go, and thought about a man who had not been in the vicinity of smiling for 8 months, and what it might mean that a yardman's hire had put him there. November arrived and settled. The frosts came down from the moor each night and silvered the drive and the paddock rails and the slates of the outer buildings, and the days shortened sharply, the light already failing by 4 in the afternoon. Thomas moved into the stable yard and performed his work with the same completeness he had brought to 3 hours in a gatehouse, doing nothing by halves and nothing by approximation. Baxter, the head groom, who managed his opinion of people over long seasons and seldom committed to a verdict before Christmas, allowed himself after 2 weeks to report privately to no one that Thomas was the first yardman in his memory who did not need to be told a thing twice. Cossack was the clearest indicator of something Baxter could not quite name. Cossack had the disposition of an animal that had been managed through fear and intermittent affection for long enough that trust was a position he took rarely and never without deliberation. He stood for Edmund and, on particular Tuesdays, for Baxter, and for no one else. On Thomas's 3rd morning in the yard, Cossack put his large head over the stall door and stayed there while Thomas worked nearby. And when Thomas drew close, the horse was entirely still, and when Thomas put a hand to the long nose, Cossack exhaled, slowly, and dropped his head. Baxter went away and thought about this for several days. He decided that some things were simply the case, and did not need explaining, which was the category he kept for things that explained themselves if you waited long enough. Clara saw Thomas each morning at the gate, and twice weekly in the evenings when she brought completed mending to the servants' hall. He was the first man in the yard each morning, and the last to leave it. He ate whatever was set before him at the servants' table, with the same careful attention he had given the heel of bread in the gatehouse, as though all food were equally worth gratitude, which was a quality rarer than it sounded. He made no enemies and no claims. He was courteous to the hall boy, and to the laundry maids, and to old Parsons, who had been the outdoor man at the hall longer than anyone except Clara, and who was treated by most of the newer staff as an inconvenient piece of the estate's history. He came to the gatehouse on his free evenings sometimes, not at her specific invitation, but not without her knowledge, and not without the understanding, which they had arrived at without discussing it, that he was welcome. The stove was warm and Newton was reliable company, and the conversation moved between them easily, in the way that conversation moves between people who are not trying to produce a particular result from it, and are therefore free to find whatever is actually there. He asked her about the estate, about the history of different fields, about which farms had gone to which families and how long they had farmed them. He asked in the way of a man whose interest is genuine and whose reasons for asking are not entirely neutral, and she answered fully, because he was asking the right questions and she had been answering questions about this land for 20 years, and it was satisfying to have them asked again. One evening in late November he asked her whether the old Duke had been a good master. Clara set down her mending. She looked at the question from several angles, because it was not a simple question dressed as a simple question. She answered it as she had answered all his questions, fully and without editing for comfort. She said he had been a complicated master. She said he had been capable of genuine kindness and genuine carelessness, often within the same hour, and that the kindness was not performed and the carelessness was not deliberate, which already placed him above most men of his station. She said he had seen the people who worked for him as people, rather than as categories of function, which she had never taken for granted, because she had worked in houses where this was not the case, and she knew what the difference felt like. She said she had disagreed with him on a number of decisions over the years, and had said so to his face when he asked her view, which he did regularly, and that he had sometimes taken the disagreement and sometimes not, but that he had always asked again the next time, which was the quality she valued most, that he was capable of asking. Thomas listened to all of this and was quiet for a moment with his mug in his hands. Then he asked if she had been sorry when he died. Clara looked at her mending, which was sitting folded in her lap. She said she had been very sorry. She said the sorry had been layered and had taken some time to fully map, and that some of the layers she was still occasionally finding. Thomas said that was a generous thing to say of a man who had made a considerable number of errors. Clara said that all men made errors. She said the question was what they did with them. She let the sentence settle where it settled, which was somewhere between a statement about the late Duke and something else entirely, and she did not clarify which. Thomas looked at the sampler. He nodded at it in the way people nod at something they are agreeing with rather than acknowledging. Then he said good evening and picked up his branch and went back out into the November dark. Clara sat for a long time afterward without returning to the mending. Newton had moved from the boots to her lap and was attending to her chin with devotion. She let him. She was within reach now of the name for what she suspected. She had been approaching it in the careful way one approaches a very bright thing, which is to say with peripheral vision rather than directly, because direct vision at certain brightnesses is simply not useful. She had been taking it in increments. The voice, the eyes, the gravity, the way he looked at the sampler, the way Cossack had put his head over the door on the third morning, the coat she had given him, which fit him across the shoulders as though it had been made for those exact shoulders, because it had been. Newton on the boots, which Newton did for no one, and Newton was never wrong. She had loved the old Duke for 17 years. She did not say this to herself in those terms and never had, because there was no utility in saying it in those terms, because the terms implied something that had no available form in the world she lived in, a woman of her station and a man of his. She said instead that she had had particular regard for his character. She said she had valued his confidence in her judgment. She said she had been devoted to the family. All of this was true, and none of it was the whole truth, and she had made her peace with that incompleteness in the way that women make peace with a great many things, by finding other purposes for the energy and never speaking of it and getting on. He had ridden into a storm and not come back. She had mourned in the way that people mourn things they were never permitted to name, which is to say quietly, internally, and for much longer than anyone observes. She put Newton off her lap. She put on her coat and her boots. She went out into the night air, which was very cold and very clear, the stars sharp as pins above the moor. She walked down past the dark bulk of the hall, past the south drain that still needed attending, along the path to the outer stable yard. The loft above the outer stable had a single candle in the window, nothing more. She stood in the cold below it for a long time. Then she walked back to the gatehouse and went to bed and looked at the ceiling until the grey morning came. Clara found the coat in December. She had been tasked, informally and without instruction from Graves, by the housekeeper's girl with sorting through the contents of a locked cedar chest in the upper servants' corridor that had been sealed since the late Duke's disappearance and had never been opened in Edmund's tenure. The housekeeper's girl had found the key among the effects of the former housekeeper, who had recently died in her retirement in the village, and she had brought it to Clara because she did not know what else to do with it, and because Clara was still, in the minds of everyone who had worked under her, the person to bring uncertain things to. Clara opened the chest on a Saturday afternoon in the first week of December. There was linen in it, carefully folded and scented with the dried lavender sachets that the old Duke's housekeeper had placed in all the storage chests every spring for 30 years. There was a pair of riding gloves that had belonged to the Duke's wife, and that no one had been able to give away. There was a bundle of the old Duke's letters, incoming ones.
From his brother in Ireland, and from his solicitors, and from 2 or 3 friends she did not know by name. And there was the coat. She knew the coat at once.
It was the one he had worn on ordinary days, the dark grey wool that was good but not formal. The coat he had worn when he walked the estate in autumn, and when he sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea on cold mornings, before the house was properly awake. She had repaired the left cuff of it herself, years ago, when a hawthorn had caught it on his morning walk and torn the wool. The repair was still there, nearly invisible if you did not know where to look, and she knew exactly where to look. She sat with the coat in her hands for a long time. Then she wrapped it carefully and took it to the gatehouse, and on the following Thursday, when Thomas came to her door, she gave it to him with the same directness she applied to everything, saying she had found it in a storage chest and that it was going to no purpose, and it would fit him well enough. She did not say whose it had been. He did not ask. He tried it on, and it fit him across the shoulders precisely, as though it had been cut for those shoulders, because it had been. He ran his hands once along the lapels, briefly, with a touch that was not quite casual, and then he thanked her in the way he thanked her for things, which was to say with the full gravity, and he kept the coat. She watched his face when he put it on, and she saw what she had expected to see, which was the smallest possible acknowledgement of recognition, a stillness of an instant, and then nothing more. She said nothing. She went back to her mending. What she was thinking as she mended was that a man who had walked away from his life had apparently walked away from it into the thing he had left behind him, which was a fair and accurate description of what most people did when they ran away from things, regardless of how far they walked. She was thinking that she had spent 17 years in the presence of a particular quality of gravity, and that she could recognise it at 30 paces or through a rainstorm, and that the coat was simply the coat, but it had said aloud what she had been saying quietly to herself for 6 weeks. She let Thomas out at the gate that night and watched him go down the drive, and the coat moved on him the way it had moved on the old Duke, with the same particular drape, and she stood in the cold until he was gone from sight, and then she went in and poured herself a cup of tea and sat down with Newton and thought carefully for a very long time about what she intended to do with what she knew. What she decided was to wait. She decided this not from uncertainty but from clarity. She had made the decision to give him the coat, and the coat had been a form of asking. Now it was his turn. She had been patient for 30 years, and she could be patient for somewhat longer. Graves brought his case against Thomas on a Wednesday afternoon in December, when the first proper snow had been falling for 2 hours and the drive was beginning to go white at the edges. He presented it with the thoroughness of a man who has been holding a case in reserve and is confident of its weight. He laid out the evidence. Thomas had been seen speaking at length with the Duke in the stable yard on multiple occasions, at durations far exceeding what yard work required. Thomas had been given a coat of apparent quality by a person as yet unidentified, indicating favouritism from some quarter. Thomas had been moved from the stable loft to a room in the outer servants' wing when the loft proved too cold, an accommodation not extended to yard men of longer standing. He had been observed by Graves himself reading a book on his free afternoon, which was not a crime, but which, combined with the other items, contributed to a picture of a man who was not what he appeared, and who set himself above his station. The word irregularities was used. The phrase not what he appears was used. The phrase I cannot put my finger on it was used more than once, which was Graves's way of indicating that the absence of articulable evidence should be understood as evidence of a more dangerous kind. Edmund listened to all of this from behind his desk with the pen still in his hand, which meant he had not given it his full attention. When Graves finished, Edmund asked him when Thomas had last eaten a full meal before arriving at Ashbourne Hall. Graves said he did not take the meaning of the question. Edmund said that was not his concern. He told Graves that Thomas would remain in his position. He told Graves that he would appreciate, by Friday morning, a complete list of all staff, indoor and outdoor, their full names and their lengths of service and their primary duties, as he had been meaning to familiarise himself properly with the people who ran the estate, and that he had decided Friday was when this would begin. Graves left without further argument, the colour of old plaster. Edmund sat alone after he left. The snow was thickening at the window, and the estate accounts were open on his desk, and the pen was still in his hand. He set the pen down. He went to the locked room he had been returning to since November, the room that still held the smell of his father's pipe and the cold of the stone in winter, and he sat in his father's chair and opened the false bottom of the writing desk and took out the letters tied in green ribbon. He had been finding reasons not to read them since he found them. He had understood, at the level beneath reason, what they were, because a man does not write letters to an initial and keep them unsent under a false bottom, unless the letters concern something that could not be said in any available form, and he had been circling that understanding at a careful distance. He read the last one. It was dated November 11 years ago. It was not long. It said that he had been wrong about most things for most of his life, and that the thing he had been most wrong about was the one he should have been most right about from the beginning. It said he had come to believe there was nothing to be done. It said that believing there was nothing to be done was the final decision of a man who had stopped having the courage to be corrected, and that he could see this clearly now, and could not see what to do with the clarity. Edmund sat with the letter until the candle needed attending. Then he put it back and set the false bottom in place, and went out and stood in the dark corridor and listened to the snow. He went to the stable yard in the morning. The snow had continued through the night and lay in a clean and undifferentiated weight on the yard stones and the stable rooftops and the arms of the linden tree. Thomas was already working when Edmund came through the gate, moving between the stalls with the quiet economy of established practice. Cossack had his head over the half-door and his ears forward. Edmund came into the yard and closed the gate behind him. The cold was thorough and the yard was quiet under it. Thomas saw him and straightened, and they stood looking at each other across the space between them, which was not large and felt very large. Edmund asked where Thomas had spent the last 11 years. The stillness that followed was of a different quality than the frost quiet of the yard. It was the stillness of a moment that has been approaching for a long time and has now arrived. Thomas set down what he was carrying. He looked at Edmund in the way he had looked at the gate in October, with the full gravity the glass removed from behind the eyes. He said he had spent 11 years learning that he was smaller than he had believed himself to be. He said he had ridden into the storm in November 11 years ago, not by accident. He said this plainly, without softening, because it was past the age for softening. He said he had been in the particular darkness that descends when a man has made every decision from the outside in, for appearance and precedence and the expectation of others, and has finally understood that the decisions he has avoided making are the ones that matter, and that it is too late, and that this conviction is the darkness speaking rather than the truth, but that the darkness is very convincing. He said he had believed, in that conviction, that his family and his estate and the people who depended on him would be better served by his absence than by his presence. He said the horse had come home because he had sent the horse home. He stopped. He put his hands in the pockets of the coat that fit him across the shoulders. Edmund stood in the snow and looked at him. Thomas continued. He said he had spent 11 years walking, which sounds simple and was not. He said he had spent 11 years being nobody in particular, and that this had done the work that nothing else had done, because the only way to find out what is left of a man when everything is removed is to remove everything. He said what was left was not a great deal, but that it was at least accurate. And that accuracy about one's own nature was, he had come to think, the beginning of most things worth beginning. He said he had not intended to come back as himself. He said he had come back because there was a woman at a gate who had given a stranger tea and bread in the rain, without asking what he deserved, and without requiring thanks in a form that served her rather than him, and that he had made a decision 30 years ago not to say what he should have said to that woman, and that 11 years of walking the roads of England had shown him with considerable thoroughness that this was the single decision he had been paying for ever since, and that a man who has spent 11 years paying for a single act of cowardice will eventually arrive at the question of whether he intends to go on paying it, or whether he intends to go back to where it began. He said he had been cowardly again at the gate, in a different register. He was aware of the pattern. Edmund had not moved. He said, "You are my father." Thomas said he was. He said he had not known how to be the thing, and also to announce it, and that this was not an excuse, but it was the truth. Edmund came through the yard toward him, crossing the snow that had been clean and undisturbed a moment ago, and stood close to the man who was wearing his father's coat in his father's stable yard, and looked at him. He was 30 years old, and he was 19 years old, and he was all the years between them, which is what large revelations do to time, collapse it into a single standing wave in which every point is simultaneously present. He said, "You have been a coward twice." Thomas said he had. Edmund said, "I have not been markedly better." Thomas looked at him. The gravity on his face shifted, became something else entirely, something that had been kept beneath the gravity for 11 years, and was only now coming to the surface, and it was not what Edmund had expected, which made it the most difficult thing he had yet had to hold. It was not pride or grief or apology. It was something that resembled relief in the way that a river resembles water after a dam has given way. Edmund said he supposed they had both better go and speak to the woman at the gate. Thomas picked up his branch. They walked through the snow together, out of the stable yard, and through the main yard and along the side of the house to the drive. They did not speak. There are things that do not need speech to be the most substantial things that have ever happened, and this was one of them. The snow was falling again lightly, and the drive was all one white thing between the lime trees, and the hall sat on its rise behind them, with its windows dark in the mid-morning light. Clara heard them on the step. She heard 2 sets of footsteps on the stone, coming up together, and she had known for the preceding hour, in the way one knows weather before it arrives, that something resolved was coming toward her. She opened the door before they knocked. They stood on her step in the light snow, Edmund with his jaw set and his eyes raw and clear, Thomas with his branch in his hand and the old Duke's coat on his shoulders, and she looked at them both and felt the thing she had been taking in increments over 2 months arrive all at once, too large now for incrementing. She stood back from the door. She let them in. Newton came from behind the trunk in his own good time, and took his customary position on Thomas's boots, and regarded Edmund with the reconsidering attention of a cat who is updating a verdict in light of new information. Clara put the kettle on the stove. She said nothing, because she was a woman who had spent her life knowing the difference between silence that needed filling and silence that was already full to its limits. She set out 3 mugs on the small table. She moved her mending to the floor and sat down in her chair. She let the 2 men find their places, which they did without instruction. Edmund on the wooden stool and Thomas on the bench where he had sat in October, and the stove ticked warmly and the snow came at the window, and Newton purred with the unreserved commitment he brought to all his undertakings. Edmund looked at the sampler on the wall for a long time. He read it twice. He looked at the stitching, which was very fine. He said carefully that he had been poorly informed about a great many things regarding the estate and the people on it, and that he intended to do considerably better, and that doing better would require assistance from people who knew the ground, and that he was hoping she would be available to provide it. Clara said she was available for consultation. Edmund said he had thought she might be. He looked at his father then, a long look, and his father looked at him, and they had between them the conversation that fathers and sons who have lost each other have, which does not use many words, but which covers the necessary ground if the silence is the right kind, and this one was. Thomas looked at Clara. He said her name. He said it in the voice beneath the other voices, the one she had heard in October, the voice before the management. He said it as a man says a word he has been keeping for a long time, examining the shape of it. Clara met his eyes and held them, because she was a woman who had been waiting 30 years for the right shape, and she was not going to look away now that it had arrived in her gatehouse out of the snow. She said, "I know who you are." She said it as one states a thing that is both enormous and, at the same time, simply and practically the case. Thomas said he had thought she might. She said, "I have thought so since October." He said, "And you said nothing." She said, "I waited to see if you were going to." The silence was the fullest the small rooms had ever held. Edmund looked between them, and then looked at his mug with the expression of a man who has found himself a witness to something important, and is doing the courtesy of looking elsewhere while it runs its course. The snow fell softly at the window. The stove gave off its heat. The cat purred. Clara poured the tea. She poured it into all 3 mugs and set the pot back on the trivet on top of the stove. The act was the smallest possible act, and it was the whole thing. The small acts sometimes contain the whole of something that cannot be said directly. She had poured tea for the late Duke 100 times across 20 years, and had never quite said, in those pourings, what she was actually saying. And she was not going to say it now either, because some things do not want to be said, and only need to be done, and this was one of them. They drank their tea. Edmund talked about the South Drain, and about graves, and about his intention to learn the estate properly, field by field, person by person, starting with the list he had requested for Friday. He talked as a man talks when the thing he most needed to say has been said in a different room and in a different medium, and he is now able to speak about practical matters, without the practical matters being all that he means. Clara answered his questions about which farms had changed in the last decade, and which tenants were reliable, and which difficulties ran below the surface of the accounts. Thomas listened and sometimes added a thing he remembered, said without ceremony, and Edmund listened to these additions with the quality of a man hearing a melody he had been missing for a long time, and not knowing, until this moment, what note was absent. The conversation after that was long. It covered things that conversations of that kind cover, the years in detail. Not all of them, but enough of them. The ones that had been the hardest, and the ones that had been instructive, and the ones that had been both at once. Edmund asked questions that were direct, and Thomas answered them without evasion. Thomas asked questions in return, and Edmund answered those with the same directness, because he was in a room with a man who had earned directness through 11 years of paying for the cost of not having it. Clara sat with her mending and listened, and occasionally said something when it was needed, and did not say things when they were not. This was the skill she had spent her life developing, and she applied it now as she always had, fully and without reserve. What she was listening to, underneath the exchange of facts and chronology, was the sound of two people who had been sealed separately beginning, in a small warm room above a gatehouse in the snow, to open in each other's vicinity. It was a slow sound, and she did not want to rush it. She had learned over a long career of managing a house full of people that the most fragile moment in any reconciliation is the moment when it looks like it might actually be happening, when the parties become aware of the possibility and either seize it too hard and break it, or draw back from it in alarm. She watched for both tendencies and said nothing designed to prevent them. She simply stayed in the room, mending her pillow slip, and let the fire be warm and the tea be adequate, and the cat purr, and let the two men find each other at whatever pace they required. Edmund, when he finally stood to leave, was different in a way she could not have precisely described, only noticed. He was still himself, still the shut and careful man who had arrived in March, but there was something in him now that had a different relation to the world around it, as though a window had been opened an inch, not wide, not dramatically, but enough that the air in the room was no longer the same air it had been. She thought, watching him go down the step, that Edmund was going to be all right. She thought that Ashbourne Hall was going to be all right. She thought, with the specific clarity of a woman who has been thinking about the same thing from many angles for many weeks, and has finally found the angle from which it is simple, that she herself was going to be considerably better than all right. Later, when the light had changed and the snow had stopped, and the moor had gone quiet under its weight, Edmund stood and said he should go back to the house. He thanked Clara, with a precision and gravity that she recognised as Edmund's version of saying considerably more than the words contained. He nodded to Thomas, a different kind of nod than the ones he had been offering at the gate, one with actual content in it. He went out, and they heard his steps on the stone and down the drive. Clara and Thomas sat in the quiet that followed. Newton had moved from the boots to the window-sill, where he was conducting his amber-eyed survey of the white drive. Thomas said she had made a very good sampler for a woman of 23. She said she had had the time and the feeling and the right thread all at once, which were the 3 requirements, and did not often coincide. He said he had been a fool for 30 years, and he knew it. She said she was aware of that. He said he was aware that she was aware. She said that was a reasonable beginning. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he would like to speak with her properly, tomorrow, if she was willing. She said she would be at the gate, as usual. He nodded. He took his branch from beside the door. He went out. She sat for a long time in the quiet after he left, and did not move to pick up her mending. Newton came from the window-sill and pressed against her leg. She put her hand on his grey head. After a while she went to the window. The gate was standing open. It had been standing open all day, from the moment Edmund had come through it without thinking to close it behind him, and it was still open now in the evening light, the iron dark against the white drive, the snow settled along its top bar. She had not closed it, and Thomas had not closed it, and she looked at it standing open, and understood that some things only need to be seen for what they are. She left it as it was. The stars were coming out above the moor, one at a time, and the hall at the top of the drive had lights in several windows that it had not had in some months. The warmth of them coming down the drive in a long thread, and the drive was one white uninterrupted thing from the gate to the house, and the gate was open, and the evening was very still. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from, and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.